Alright, so I know what you're thinking. Why is there a Punisher video? It's not even a Capcom versus game, or even a fighting game for that matter. I'll address that right now. No, the Punisher isn't a Capcom versus game or a fighting game, and yet, the Marvel vs. Capcom games as a whole partially owe part of their existence to this game. The Punisher was the very first Marvel game developed by Capcom, and the title that began their close working relationship in the 1990s. Capcom had made a name for themselves with their arcade and console games already, but they'd also been a close partner of another big company outside of gaming, Disney. With hits like DuckTales, Rescue Rangers, and Disney's Magical Quest, Capcom had proved that even licensed properties were in safe hands with them, so it's easy to see why Marvel might have approached them. Moreover, their success with this game is what directly led to Marvel approaching Capcom for an entirely different pitch altogether, to use their fighting game experience to create a game in the genre based on the incredibly popular X-Men, which would become the game we now know as X-Men Children of the Atom. The Punisher, however, is a beat-em-up similar in style to Capcom's own Final Fight, among others. It's far from the only licensed Capcom beat-em-up. Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, Dungeons and Dragons, and most notably Alien vs. Predator are examples of other licensed beat-em-ups from Capcom. While it's not a Marvel vs. Capcom game, it's clear that Capcom still considers it a precursor of sorts, as it's been associated with the series in two separate ways. In the Marvel vs. Capcom Complete Works art book, it has its own segment right alongside the fighting games proper. And most recently and relevantly, was made available in the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection as a playable game, marking the first time the game has ever received an arcade-perfect home release, and it only took 31 years. So today, I'd actually like to talk about the game, the characters, the movesets, and the comic book references in largely the same way I would for a Capcom vs. Legacy character video. I have at least two other Marvel games from Capcom I plan on talking about in the same capacity at some point in the future as well. You can probably guess which ones they are. That said, let's dive on into things. The Punisher is a 1993 arcade beat-em-up running on Capcom's CPS-1 hardware, the same board that ran the likes of Final Fight, The King of Dragons, and Street Fighter II, to name a few. This game was directed by Noritaka Funemizu, and boy did this man have his hands in a lot of Capcom's biggest games. He was a planner on games like UN Squadron and Warriors of Fate, a designer on Forgotten Worlds and Sidearms Hyperdyne, as well as having involvement with the production of Street Fighter Alpha 1 and 2, and serving as a general producer for a ton of games, including the Marvel vs. games up to Marvel 2. He left Capcom in the mid-2000s to form his own company, Crafts and Meister. They've mostly been doing the Gundam Breaker games for Namco these days, but probably their most well-known game outside of that is the PS2 fighting game Super Dragon Ball Z, which actually has a pretty cool competitive scene to this day. The game's promotional artwork was done by Haruki Soesugu, known by his handle Sensei at Capcom. He's more known for his Mega Man artwork, having done promo work for the X series in particular, as well as being the primary character designer for Zack and Wiki. According to a 1995 interview with he and a few other Capcom artists, he actually had a bit of trouble coming up with the game's art since Western character design was a bit out of his wheelhouse. The game's soundtrack was composed by the duo responsible for the soundtrack for their biggest arcade game, Street Fighter II, Yoko Shimomura and Isao Abe. The Punisher's only official soundtrack release was a Japan-only item that also compiled the soundtracks for Warriors of Fate and Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. But unfortunately, the packaging and liner notes don't seem to credit who did every individual song. Listening to the music, you can make some guesses if you're familiar with both composer style though. The Stage 1 theme is in, and someone more versed in music theory, please feel free to correct me here, what sounds like a 13/8 time signature, which is relatively uncommon. This sounds like it'd point to it being done by Isao Abe, who made time signatures of that nature something of a signature for him. But the instrumentation absolutely screams Shimomura. In any case, it's a pretty fantastic soundtrack all around. Like most beat-em-ups, this can be played in co-op, and player 2 will be assigned the role of Nick Fury. Fury being here is cool, but seems kinda random, at least at first. Frank himself is ex-military, and Fury is an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., so it kinda makes sense. He's probably also a character Marvel wouldn't have any reservations being depicted gunning people down, given his Howling Commando days and all. The Punisher was also notably the first game Katsuya Akitomo, a name you might be familiar with if you watch these videos, was assigned to upon joining Capcom. According to Akitomo, he didn't have any involvement in the game's character selection process, but noted that Wolverine Bloody Choices, a 1991 graphic novel, and second in the trilogy of Wolverine and Nick Fury stories, was used as reference material. In Bloody Choices, Wolverine is trying to protect a young boy from a criminal who's recently gotten immunity in exchange for testimony for other criminal cases, leading to him being protected by Nick Fury as an important witness, which is how he and Wolverine end up clashing. He was given a green and brown colored design here to more easily differentiate him from the Punisher's primary colors in co-op play. All that said, Fury does fit the somewhat gritty nature of the game, so his inclusion here is more than welcome in my opinion. He also notably has different dialogue from Frank if you play as him throughout the game. If you play as both characters together in co-op, they'll yet again have different lines, most of them having Fury trying to get Frank to tone down the collateral damage. Punisher and Fury largely share a single moveset, though some animations differ between the two. There's two main actions, attack and jump. Pressing attack, well, has your character attack. Pressing it consecutively does a multi-hit combo. Pressing jump, predictably, has your character jump. As with a lot of brawlers of the time, there's also a dash done by double tapping either forward or backward. What's particularly interesting about this dash is that it doubles as an evasive maneuver. If you hold forward or back for the second tap motion, your character will continuously roll for a bit before coming to a stop. You can actually move vertically and horizontally during this time, and it can get you out of some tight spaces. You have a unique attack that can be done out of the roll as well, which will knock enemies back. There's also a jump kick you can do as well, by jumping, then pressing attack. If you do a jump kick out of a roll, your momentum gets carried into the jump kick as well. Moreover, if you press attack at the maximum height of your jump, it'll have the properties of a dive kick. You can also do a wall kick by jumping towards a wall, holding in the direction of the wall, then pressing attack at the wall itself while holding the opposite direction. This is basically a more offensive version of the wall kick maneuver a guy can do in the Final Fight games. Like every other beat 'em up ever, walking into opponents initiates a grab. You can jump with most grabbed enemies and follow up with an air throw as well. However, if you jump but press down and attack, you'll do an Izuna drop. This will knock away enemies that happen to be right under where you land, by the way. This one's interesting, since it's actually undocumented on the arcade cabinet's control panel. Pressing down, then up and attack has you do a unique kick attack whose animation changes depending on the character, though they're the same functionally. Punisher does a heel kick, and Fury straight up does a flash kick. Pressing attack and jump gives you the usual Mega Crush, a staple in Capcom beat-em-ups and brawlers in general. Frank and Fury both have unique animations for theirs. Doing this in the air has your character throw a grenade down, which does area of effect damage. You only get a few number of these per life though. Doing one with an enemy grabbed will do a special throw Mega Crash attack. There's several stages and all to cover here, so let's get into things. The vast majority of this game scenario largely lifts characters from Mike Baron's run on the Punisher from the late 80s. While some enemies in the game are characters from the comics mixed in with original enemies, every boss in the game is a character that's appeared in Punisher comics at some point. We'll talk about the comic book references as they come. Stage 1 starts in a seedy bar and casino. After roughing up a few thugs, Bruno comes out. We'll talk about him in a sec. The level then moves outside and introduces the player to gun mode. If Frank or Fury encounter any enemies that are either robotic in nature or wielding guns of their own, they whip out their guns and can shoot them. Punisher and Fury are only human after all. Can't very well bring fists to a gunfight with that in mind. Punisher uses a van to chase down the bus, demanding to know where Bruno is, but he encounters a henchman instead, Scully. The van here is most likely the battle van, a vehicle equipped with all kinds of gadgets and weaponry, on top of being used for transportation. The van is usually blue, though issue 16 of Mike Baron's run has him use a red version, which is an exact match for the one used in the game. Scully, full name Chester Scully, hails from issues 22 and 23 of Baron's Punisher run. There, Frank infiltrates a supposed ninja training camp ran by Scully in order to track down some files. His cover gets blown and he ends up having to fight Scully and his dog, though Scully dies at the end of issue 23. Upon meeting Scully, Frank and Nick demand to know Bruno's whereabouts, to which Scully obliges. He's rewarded with a nice close-range gunshot. Akitomo specifically noted the first time he saw this scene during development and said it gave him confidence that the game's lead planner, who developed the scenario for the game, truly understood what kind of person Punisher was. Stage 2 is primarily inspired by Volume 1 of Marvel Super Action, released in 1975. This was a black and white book of one-shot stories featuring different Marvel characters, including the likes of Huntress, though she later get her more famous codename as Mockingbird. The first story in the book has Frank explaining how he became the Punisher to a supposed date of his, recalling the murder of his family and his hunt for the man responsible, Bruno Costa. Bruno himself was one of the leading members of the Magia, which is basically Marvel's version of the Mafia, who had been in the middle of executing a banker in Central Park that had been framed to look like he was setting the Magia up. Unfortunately, the Castle family accidentally stumbled on the scene and, well, you know the rest. Stage 2's name is Raid on Panta Verde, though this is something of a mistranslation. The actual name of the location in the comics is Punta Verde and is where Bruno resides. The stage begins with Frank and Nick sneaking into the property through the drainage pipes of Bruno's swimming pool. This directly references the Marvel Super Action story, where Frank goes underwater to plant a bomb in a nearby oil drum to cause a large explosion. With the distraction that causes, Frank is able to slip into the drain pipe for the swimming pool mostly undetected. In the game, Frank makes his way from the swimming pool into the Costa residence, passing by some locked cells. Frank can let the people locked in here out. Doing so in the fighting collection specifically grants you a trophy or in-game achievement, depending on the platform. Here, Frank will also start fighting some specific men in suits. These are Bruno's associates and members of the Magia that were also there when Frank's family was killed. This includes Byron Hannigan and Luis Alegre, who were killed by Frank in the same Marvel Super Action comic issue, as well as Matt Skinner and Kolsky. If you look closely, there's also a portrait of a certain someone you can actually bash as well. When you step into the boss room, you're confronted by Bruno and his lackeys in an aquarium. This comes from Frank's confrontation with Kolsky in Marvel Super Action, where he maintained an aquarium in his basement with a shark in it. During their standoff, Kolsky shoots at Frank, hitting the tank behind him, which lets out the shark, who proceeds to do what sharks do to Kolsky. After this, Frank makes his way to Bruno's room, only to find that he'd been killed by a separate assassin already, robbing Frank of the chance to get revenge by his own hands. In the game, Bruno is also taken out before Frank can get him as well, but not in the way that you'd think. So, as random as a giant robot seems as a boss here, this actually does have roots in the comics. This is a guard droid, and these originally belonged to Dr. Doom, but were stolen and reprogrammed by the game's true antagonist, the Kingpin. In issue 28 of Mike Baron's Punisher run, as part of the Acts of Vengeance crossover, where Marvel villains decide to switch which antagonist they usually fight, Kingpin goads Dr. Doom into trying to take down the Punisher. Doom isn't really interested in picking a fight and sends a Doombot to meet Frank, not intending to hurt him, but to prove a point to Kingpin that he could absolutely have Frank killed whenever he'd like. Frank being Frank, destroys the Doombot and heads to Latveria. While sneaking into the castle, he encounters a guard droid, which towers over him. After beating it, Frank realizes Kingpin was behind everything and sets his sights on him. Stage 3 takes place by some warehouse docks. You continue to see parts of Bruno's crew show up as enemies here, along with some new enemies. The most notable new enemy here is Pretty Boy. Pretty Boy is a member of the Reavers, a group of cybernetically enhanced foes that typically antagonize the X-Men, Pretty Boy himself first appearing in issue 229 of Uncanny X-Men. He's treated as a basic enemy here, with multiple versions of him showing up throughout the level and the game as a whole. Once you get into the warehouse, you encounter the level's boss, Bonebreaker. Bonebreaker is like Pretty Boy, a member of the Reavers, and also debuted in issue 229 of Uncanny X-Men, though as far as the Punisher is concerned, is part of a 2-issue arc during Mike Baron's run in issues 33 and 34. Bonebreaker from the waist down is literally a tank with a bunch of weaponry on it, so he actually makes for a pretty sensible beat-em-up boss. Defeating him actually completely separates his top half from the tank part. Ouch. Stage 4 takes place in an underground poppy field owned by Kingpin in an Arizona cave, where you move from hoofing it across railroad tracks to actually hopping aboard a train called the Death Express. Nick Fury has a line here in the stage's intro that references Kingpin being a humble spice trader. This is in reference to a cover story Kingpin used early on in his career to explain his wealth and business dealings to the public. The boss of this stage is Bushwhacker, who originally debuted in issue 248 of Daredevil during Ann Nocenti's run. Bushwhacker, real name Carl Burbank, is an ex-Catholic priest that joined the CIA and had himself outfitted with a cybernetic arm that can transform into all kinds of weapons. He was most likely selected due to his appearance in Punisher War Journal issues 12 and 13 by Carl Potts. There, again as part of the aforementioned Acts of Vengeance crossover, Kingpin, now wanting to prove a point to Doom about how hard Frank is to kill, hires Bushwhacker to assassinate him. Stage 5 starts with Kingpin declaring war on Punisher and Fury, sending henchmen to Punisher's hideout. The Kingpin graphic here seems to specifically be a redrawn version of this panel from issue 15 of Mike Baron's Punisher run. The first half of this level takes place in the sewers, with the second part taking place in a wooded area, the level's final scene just overlooking Manhattan. The boss of this level is just a recolored stronger Guardroid though. Before we get to that final stage though, just because Punisher isn't in Marvel vs. Capcom doesn't mean I can't do a comic recommendation. So Frank has years of stories to pull from for recommendations here, and there's quite a few that are actually really good. I'll get this out of the way now. Pretty much anything Garth Ennis wrote for the character is top shelf Punisher stuff. His run on Punisher Max in particular is pretty much unanimously heralded as the best Punisher run of all time. It's definitely a good read, but do be warned that because it's in Marvel's Max imprint, it's allowed to play fast and loose with the gore and such, and things can get pretty brutal, so keep that in mind. Consider this my secondary recommendation. There's also pretty much nothing in the way of appearances from other Marvel characters in the book aside from a handful of Nick Fury cameos, as the Max series isn't a part of main continuity and exists in a world without superheroes. Other Ennis Punisher books I'd recommend is his Marvel Knights work, as well as Punisher Born, a fantastic story chronicling Frank's Vietnam days. If you want a more classic comic bookish take on the character that utilizes his place in the Marvel universe a bit more, Mike Baron's run is a pretty good shout as well. It's pretty classic Punisher stuff, and if you like the tone and aesthetics of the Capcom game, this is easy to recommend. Punisher War Journal's original run in the late 80s to early 90s is also pretty good and features some of Jim Lee's earliest Marvel work. There's some other stories from Jason Aaron and Chuck Dixon that are also really good, but instead of just recommending Ennis' run and calling it a day, I wanted to highlight another really good Punisher run. This one's from a writer I've recommended before, particularly for their Wolverine run, and as it turns out, they have a fantastic Punisher run to their name as well. Like their Wolverine run, it's a bit unique in how it handles the book's namesake. This video's comic book recommendation is the 2011 run of The Punisher by Greg Rucka. Things start with a wedding reception being crashed by an unknown gang, shooting indiscriminately at the guests and killing many innocent people in the process. As the police track down leads to narrow down the list of possible factions that could have pulled it off, they're targeted by the Punisher. The sole survivor of the attack is Marine Sergeant Rachel Cole, the bride and now widow. As it turns out, the entire thing went down because some people working for Daredevil villain The Owl crashed the reception as a means to hide from the organization pursuing them, The Exchange. So that they can make sure they killed the right people, The Exchange killed nearly everyone at the reception to cover their bases. Wanting revenge, Rachel infiltrates the Exchange and kills a bunch of them before the Punisher shows up and tells her to stay out of his way. She keeps it up though, and eventually, Frank ends up becoming an ally, both of them waging a war against the Exchange. What makes this run interesting is how Frank is depicted throughout it. He's not actually the point of view character for the vast majority of the book, instead primarily showing Rachel's view of things. Frank actually speaks very little in the run, almost being something of a force of nature. It's meant to illustrate how Frank's actions as the Punisher reverberate through the lives of people in proximity of him, and how they almost always end up turning things for the worse. Punisher books are at their best when they examine Frank's actions, and this run is a great showcase of the fact that, for better or worse, there's only one person truly broken and messed up enough to be the Punisher, and whether other people aspire to it or not, that person will always be Frank Castle. It's a short 16-issue run that gets followed up in some issues of Punisher Warzone that's also written by Rucka. While it's largely a Punisher story, some other Marvel characters do get involved a bit, like Vulture and Daredevil. The final stage is King Tower, a skyscraper in Kingpin's main place of business. It's visually based off of the King's Inn, a similar casino tower from issue 16 of Mike Baron's Punisher run, where Kingpin plans to collect some illegally amassed funds. The vast majority of the level structure is inspired by a sequence in the aforementioned issue 16 of Baron's run, from Punisher using a grenade launcher from a distance to gain access to the building, to making his way deeper in the building through the elevator shaft. Here, you fight Jigsaw. Jigsaw is, for all intents and purposes, Punisher's arch nemesis. William Russo was a hitman hired to clean up some loose ends, including Frank himself, after the murder of the Castle family. In one of his first rampages as the Punisher, he encounters him and throws him face first into a glass pane. He survives, but the glass does immeasurable damage to his face, having to be stitched up, inspiring the name he'd take up afterwards. He debuted in issue 161 of The Amazing Spider-Man, which somewhat informs his appearance here. He's wearing a special exoskeleton, one he specifically uses when going up against particularly powerful foes. He's treated as more of a beefed up standard enemy than a proper boss here, though he is permanently wielding an assault rifle. After beating him and working your way through one more passage, you finally encounter the big man himself, Kingpin. According to Katsuya Akitomo, the original plan for Kingpin was for him to be way larger, almost filling up the screen. When they showed it to Marvel, they rejected it and told them to make him smaller, as he'd usually never been that big in the comics. The artist who'd worked on the initial design, Akiman, told him about that story, and Akitomo responded by showing him bits from Daredevil Love and War, which actually did depict Kingpin as comically large. Akitomo goes on to say that that experience taught him the importance of having good knowledge of the source material when dealing with Marvel. Legendary Final Fight and Street Fighter II designer, as well as founder of Arika, Akira Nishitani, also relayed a similar story, noting that he was reminded of it when seeing the even more exaggerated in size Kingpin from Into the Spider-Verse. Kingpin largely walks around and tries to hit you with his cane, as well as jumping at you if you go too far and sending henchmen at you. Two of his attacks are based off of weapons he uses in the comics, however. Occasionally, Kingpin will lift his tie pin and gas will come out of it, damaging your character. This is a trick he usually keeps up his sleeve in the comics, first being used in issue 51 of The Amazing Spider-Man. He'll also occasionally shoot a laser from the cane as well. This is something he routinely utilizes, though he did it in his very first appearance in issue 50 of The Amazing Spider-Man. Once Kingpin goes down, Punisher and Fury escape the building, head into the battle van, and leave the tower to crumble in the battle's wake. In the game's ending, however, Kingpin's body is apparently never found. Before we finish up, I want to talk about a few more miscellaneous things about the game. I mentioned that the game uses Capcom CPS-1 board, but that's actually only half right. It's actually one of a handful of games that runs on the CP dashboard, an enhanced version of the board that's something of a half step between the original board and its successor, the CPS-2 board. Notably, these were the first Capcom arcade boards to implement Q-Sound technology, which would go on to define the sound of Capcom's 2D arcade output from the mid-90s onward. We've already talked about how there's different dialogue in the game depending on which character you choose and if you play in co-op or not. But another detail that's easy to miss is that the stage names are actually different for each character too. Speaking of character-dependent details, on the Game Over screen, the characters attempting to resuscitate the player differs depending on the character. For Frank, it's David Lieberman, better known as Microchip, Frank's personal hacker and tech man for most of the late 80s to the mid-90s. He most notably created the various battle vans Frank used throughout that time period. For Fury, it's Alexander Pierce, accompanied by Kathleen Neville. Both characters debuted in Nick Fury vs. S.H.I.E.L.D., a 1988 espionage comic miniseries where Fury uncovers a conspiracy within S.H.I.E.L.D. and has to go underground to stop it, roping only trusted comrades in the loop, including Kathleen and Alexander. Marvel Superheroes and Marvel vs. Capcom 1 notably use each Marvel character's personalized comic book logo in the matchup and the character select screens respectively, but this trend actually started with the Punisher. Both Frank and Fury have a specialized font for their name above their life bar. Frank has the classic Punisher logo. Fury's isn't as obvious and looks rather plain in comparison, but it's taken from the Nick Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. logo, specifically the same font used for the S.H.I.E.L.D. part of the logo. I mentioned the Japanese version of the game before, but the stage names aren't even close to being the biggest change. There's actually a move exclusive to that version. If you do a roll into a jump, then hold down and attack, Frank and Fury will do a diving flame kick, setting the opponent on fire. Definitely not something I recall happening in the comics, so I'm sure someone at Capcom just thought it was cool and went with it. The heel kick move also notably sets the opponent alight with the same blue flames in the Japanese version. In the international versions, they just spurt a bit of blood when hit. Both the English and Japanese ROM can be selected in the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection, so take a look at some of these changes for yourself the next time you boot it up. There's an unfinished bonus stage that was seemingly cut from the main game, involving what looks to be a plane hijacking. This was found years ago by people digging into the ROM, and while the stage boots up, it ends several seconds after starting the stage no matter what you do. Afterwards, the credit sequence that plays is the special one that gets unlocked when you complete the game on one credit. This stage was likely inspired by Punisher War Journal issue 50, which saw Frank similarly thwart a plane hijacking. Interestingly, the Marvel vs. Capcom Fighting Collection actually lets you access this stage freely. Boot up the game, go to the option that lets you choose your starting stage, and scroll until you get an option that only consists of question marks. Select it and you can see the stage for yourself. Functionally useless since the level is still incomplete, but it's a neat bit of preservation on Capcom's end to pull the curtain back a bit there. While the Marvel vs. Capcom collection is the first time we've gotten the arcade game with no compromises on consoles, it's not the only console port of the game. It was notably ported to the Sega Genesis in 1995, the port not being developed by Capcom, but instead Sculptured Software, whose most notable projects included the Super Nintendo ports of Mortal Kombat 1 and 2, as well as the gaming masterpiece Virtual Bart. This port is not good. The Genesis color palette limitations are on full display here, and the sprites aren't anywhere near as big, well animated, or detailed. There's some additional censorship, notably in the scene after the first boss fight. Frank doesn't shoot Scully point blank, but instead just throws him off screen. Some of the enemies also have altered sprites as well. The guard droid in Stage 2 also curiously has a completely different design that doesn't resemble the original at all. The original sprite was kinda similar to what Sentinel would eventually animate like in Children of the Atom, where it was made up of smaller, independently animating segments, so I imagine that was a little above the Genesis's pay grade. Speaking of hardware limitations, the Mega Crush throw from the arcade game is absent too. Instead, Frank or Fury will slam the opponent a few times on both sides before one big slam. Its function is essentially the same, but it looks way less cool. You know, despite being an important stepping stone in forming the working relationship between Capcom and Marvel, the Punisher himself has actually been relatively scarce in the Versus games. He doesn't show up at all in the earlier entries, though he's referenced twice in Marvel 3. He and Kingpin are both Heroes and Heralds cards, and Frank's ability gives your team a power boost when your teammates are KO'd, which is kind of funny in a dark way, I suppose. More notably, one of Captain America's colors is specifically the Captain America tribute costume Frank wore in the wake of Cap's death at the end of Civil War in the comics, at least until Bucky pulled up and told him to cut it out. Punisher himself was briefly considered by the developers during Marvel 3's development, though he was passed up because they thought there would be a bit too much overlap with Chris, which is fair, looking at Chris's moveset. Still though, I wonder if he'll ever get his day in the sun. It'd be neat to see him with a moveset that uses the arcade game as a base. Think Chris, but more mobile with command rows and such. That'd be neat. I'm glad the original arcade game can be more widely played and even in the physical version at that. It's one of Capcom's best in the genre, and it was criminal, no pun intended, that it wasn't legally accessible for so long. That's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons that support the channel. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.